Every human being senses, at some point in life, an inner restlessness that cannot be quieted by the noise of the world. We rise each morning surrounded by responsibilities, expectations, comparisons, and the silent pressure to keep up with the pace of society. Yet behind the activity of our days lies a more private struggle, the feeling that we have drifted away from ourselves, from our inner clarity, from the quiet center in which the soul can breathe. The world invites us outward, but wisdom calls us inward, and between these two forces we find the modern human dilemma. To focus on oneself is not a selfish act, though many confuse it with self-absorption. Rather, it is the recognition that one cannot offer truth, goodness, or meaning to the world if one stands estranged from one's own soul. Maimônides understood this tension with striking clarity. Writing in an age of political upheavals, philosophical conflict, and spiritual confusion, he saw that the greatest threat to human flourishing is not external chaos, but internal fragmentation. When the soul becomes scattered, reason weakens, emotions darken, and the sense of purpose dissolves. The individual becomes reactive rather than deliberate, restless rather than stable, easily influenced rather than self-directed. This inner fragmentation is not unique to any era. It is a universal human experience. We sense a gap between who we believe ourselves capable of becoming and who we are in practice. We recognize moments of insight that quickly fade under the weight of habit. We experience a longing for meaning that becomes overshadowed by daily noise. And at the heart of these struggles lies a question that drives the entire journey of personal transformation. How does one elevate the soul in a world that constantly pulls the mind downward? The answer does not lie in escaping the world, for Maimônides taught that perfection requires engagement with life, not rejection of it. Nor does the answer lie in blind spiritual emotion, detached from reason, for this leads to confusion and instability. Instead, the heart of the dilemma is understanding how to reclaim the self from distraction, illusion, and emotional turbulence. To elevate the soul, one must first gather the mind. To refine the character, one must first clarify perception. To approach the divine, one must first learn to approach oneself with sincerity. Yet focusing on oneself is far more difficult than it appears. The human mind instinctively seeks outward stimulation. It is easier to judge others than to examine one's own impulses. It is easier to chase achievements than to confront personal contradictions. It is easier to adopt the opinions of others than to discipline the intellect into independent understanding. The outward path is seductive because it gives the illusion of progress. The inward path requires courage, stillness, and honesty. Maimônides warned that without self-examination, the intellect becomes clouded by desire, habit, and emotion. These forces, if left unchecked, distort perception and lead to choices that harm both oneself and others. The world is filled with people who appear active but lack direction, who appear confident but lack self-knowledge, who appear free but are enslaved by impulses they never took the time to observe. The tragedy of the human condition is not lack of potential, but lack of introspection. To focus on oneself, in the Maimonidean sense, is to engage in a deliberate return, a return to reason, to virtue, to clarity, to purpose. It is a process of refining the inner instrument through which we understand the world. When the soul becomes disciplined, perception becomes accurate. When perception becomes accurate, choices become wise. And when choices become wise, the path of the soul rises naturally. But the struggle is real and familiar. The individual feels the tension between what is higher and what is easier. The noise of society praises speed, but wisdom requires patience. Social comparison fuels insecurity, but introspection builds strength. External achievements bring temporary satisfaction, but inner development creates lasting transformation. Every day, one stands between two voices, one calling outward toward distraction, the other calling inward toward truth. This is where the dilemma deepens. Humans often fear the inward journey, because to focus on oneself is to face the truth of one's limitations and contradictions. It is to recognize the gap between aspiration and action. It is to realize that true growth demands responsibility, and responsibility requires discipline. The path of self-elevation cannot be outsourced. No other person can think on your behalf. No one can refine your character for you. No one can bring calm to your emotions or clarity to your intentions. These pursuits belong to the individual alone. Maimônides saw this as the greatest dignity of the human being, the capacity for self-transformation through disciplined thought and ethical action. He believed that the highest form of worship is the perfection of the intellect and the refinement of the soul, not in the sense of intellectual pride, but in the sense of drawing the mind closer to truth, and through truth to the divine. When a person aligns their inner world with reality, they elevate their soul. This elevation begins with attention. Not attention to status or outward success, but attention to one's inner life, thoughts, beliefs, habits, emotions, and the quiet motivations that shape decision and character. Without attention, the soul drifts. With attention, the soul awakens. And awakening the soul is not an instant revelation. It is a steady, disciplined process of returning to clarity every time the world pulls us away. Maimônides believed that spiritual growth resembles the training of a skilled artisan or physician, precise, methodical, guided by knowledge, and practiced with devotion. The soul is elevated not through sudden bursts of inspiration, but through sustained engagement with truth and virtue. Thus, the dilemma of focusing on oneself reveals a deeper truth. The inner world is the true battlefield of human life. The victory is not measured in external accomplishments, but in the clarity of the mind, the strength of the character, and the purity of intention. The world can be chaotic, but the soul can be ordered. The world can be loud, but the mind can remain quiet. The world can be uncertain, but the heart can be anchored in wisdom. To elevate the soul is to choose this inner alignment over confusion, this clarity over distraction, this self-knowledge over illusion. It is to embrace the noble challenge of becoming the person one is capable of being. This is the beginning of the journey. Maimônides invites us to take the journey inward toward reason, virtue, and the divine light that resides in understanding. To understand how one can focus inward and elevate the soul, one must step into the intellectual world of Maimônides, where reason and revelation form a single, harmonious pursuit. Maimônides approached the human condition not through mystical speculation, but through disciplined analysis of the mind, the emotions, and the moral life. He believed that the greatest gift given to humanity is the intellect, for through the intellect, the soul rises from confusion to clarity, from instinct to wisdom, from perception to understanding. In the Guide for the Perplexed, Maimônides describes humanity as standing between two realms, the realm of the physical instincts and the realm of the intellect. When the instincts dominate, the soul becomes enslaved to desire, anxiety, fear, and the endless pursuit of gratification. But when the intellect leads, the soul becomes ordered, purposeful, and attuned to truth. The challenge of life, therefore, is to elevate the intellect so that it guides the emotions rather than being drowned by them. Maimônides held that most human suffering arises not from external events, but from internal misperception. We fear things that do not deserve fear. We desire things that bring no lasting benefit. We pursue illusions as if they were real. And we neglect what truly elevates us because it demands effort and discipline. In this sense, focusing on oneself means realigning the mind with reality, a process that requires honest examination, careful reasoning, and the humility to acknowledge one's limitations. In his 8 chapters, the introduction to his commentary on Pirkei Avot, Maimônides explains that the soul is composed of different faculties, desires, emotions, imagination, intellect, and that each must be balanced for the human being to flourish. The problem is not that we have desires or emotions or instincts. The problem is when these faculties dominate the intellect and lead it astray. The goal is not suppression, but harmony. The soul becomes elevated when each dimension functions in its rightful place, guided by reason, refined by virtue, and illuminated by understanding. This harmonization of the soul requires what Maimônides famously calls the golden mean. Every trait has two extremes, one of excess, one of deficiency. Anger may explode in destructive fury or collapse into passive weakness. Courage may turn into reckless foolishness or paralyzing fear. Ambition may rise to arrogant greed or sink into apathetic resignation. The wise person, says Maimônides, cultivates the middle path, measured, balanced, deliberate. This moderation is not mediocrity, it is strength under control, directed toward higher purpose. To focus on oneself in the Maimonidean sense is therefore to constantly calibrate the inner life. It is to observe one's tendencies, inclinations, and habits, and to ask whether they lead toward clarity or toward confusion. Maimonides insists that virtue is a habit formed through repeated action. A person does not become patient by wishing to be patient, but by practicing patience. The soul becomes refined through sustained discipline, not through momentary inspiration. At the same time, Maimonides warns against a purely ethical or psychological approach that ignores the intellectual dimension. The aim is not merely to behave well, but to understand deeply. The highest level of human perfection is not moral goodness alone, but intellectual clarity that leads to the love of God. For Maimonides, knowledge is not cold or distant. It is the path to spiritual intimacy. Through understanding the order, wisdom, and unity of existence, the human soul experiences profound nearness to the divine. This is why he dedicates vast portions of the Mishneh Torah, a legal code, to the training of the mind and the cultivation of proper beliefs. In the opening chapters of Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah, he describes knowledge of God as the foundation of all spiritual life. To know the Creator even in our limited human capacity is to elevate the soul to its highest potential, and this knowledge is achieved not through imagination but through disciplined inquiry, contemplation, and study of the natural world. But Maimonides never forgets the emotional dimension. He understands that the intellect cannot operate freely if the emotions are in turmoil. A person dominated by anxiety cannot think clearly. A person enslaved by anger cannot perceive truth. A person overwhelmed by desire cannot pursue virtue. Thus, the refinement of emotion is essential to the elevation of the soul. This is why Maimonides also wrote medical works addressing emotional health. He saw the mind and body as intertwined, each influencing the other. To elevate the soul, one must also cultivate physical discipline, moderation in habits, and a lifestyle conducive to mental clarity. Health, for Maimonides, is not merely physical. It is ethical and spiritual, and yet, for all his rationalism, Maimonides does not reduce the human being to intellect alone. He affirms the profound significance of purpose, reverence, devotion, and the mysterious longing of the soul for something beyond the material. The intellect, when properly cultivated, does not lead to arrogance but to awe. It does not produce cold detachment but humility. True knowledge expands the soul's sensitivity to the sacred. This synthesis, reason guiding emotion, emotion deepening devotion, devotion inspiring understanding, is at the heart of Maimonides' perspective on self-focus and soul elevation. He insists that the human being is capable of rising above the instinctual level of existence. We are not trapped by our nature. We can shape it, refine it, and lift it toward truth. Yet Maimonides is realistic. He knows that the inward path is slow, difficult, and demanding. He writes not as a preacher offering comfort, but as a physician diagnosing the human condition. His prescriptions require discipline, patience, and persistence, but he believes that every person, regardless of their starting point, can elevate their soul through the cultivation of wisdom, virtue, and clarity. To focus on oneself, in his framework, is to take responsibility for the state of one's inner life. It is to refuse to remain passive in the face of confusion. It is to choose growth over stagnation, truth over illusion, and reason over impulse. And it is to recognize that the journey of self-elevation is the greatest gift one can offer not only to oneself, but to the world. For when a person becomes clear, balanced, and wise, their presence brings light to others. When a person elevates their soul, their actions become rooted in integrity rather than ego. When a person refines their mind, their life becomes guided by truth rather than by the fluctuations of the moment. This, for Maimônides, is the true measure of human greatness. To understand Maimônides is to understand a harmony rarely achieved in human thought, a unity between intellect and devotion, between reason and reverence, between the order of the mind and the yearning of the soul. He does not ask us to choose between these realms, for to divide them is to divide the human being. Instead, he teaches that the soul rises when understanding deepens, and understanding deepens when the soul is pure, disciplined, and attuned to truth. This synthesis forms the heart of spiritual elevation. It begins with the recognition that the human being is capable of perceiving the divine, not merely through emotion or belief, but through the pursuit of knowledge. For Maimônides, learning is not an academic exercise. It is a form of worship. To contemplate the structure of existence, to study the laws of nature, to grasp the order, harmony, and unity present in all things. This is to draw nearer to God. Through knowledge, one perceives the wisdom that sustains the universe, and in perceiving it, one's soul becomes illuminated. But this illumination cannot occur in a mind clouded by emotional disorder. Maimônides therefore insists that intellectual clarity and emotional refinement are inseparable. The more ordered the heart, the more receptive the intellect. The more disciplined the intellect, the more peaceful the heart. Thus, spiritual growth is not a flight from the world, but the deepening of one's engagement with reality. To elevate the soul is to see the world as it truly is, and in seeing it, to sense the silent presence of the Creator. Maimônides describes this process as the knowledge that leads to love. When the intellect contemplates the beauty of creation, the precision of its laws, the elegance of its order, the subtlety of its design, it is moved to awe, and from awe emerges love. Not a love rooted in emotion alone, but a love born of understanding. This love does not fade with circumstance, for it is grounded in truth, not in momentary feeling. Thus the elevation of the soul becomes a dance between understanding and devotion. The mind seeks comprehension, and the heart responds with reverence. The more one understands, the more one loves. The more one loves, the more one longs to understand. This cycle forms the spiritual engine of Maimônides' philosophy. Yet this path demands discipline. It requires the individual to quiet the noise of external distractions and cultivate the stillness necessary for contemplation. Maimônides speaks often of solitude, not as withdrawal from society, but as the inner posture one brings to life. Even in the midst of activity, one can maintain a quiet center. This inner stillness allows the intellect to rise above impulses and focus on what is true and enduring. In this inner stillness, the soul begins to perceive a deeper dimension of existence. The world is no longer a series of disconnected events, but a structured, purposeful reality. Human life is no longer random, but meaningful. The self is no longer fragmented, but unified. The mind becomes a vessel for clarity, and clarity becomes a pathway to the divine. For Maimônides, the true measure of spiritual elevation is not mystical visions or emotional ecstasy. It is the alignment of the soul with reality. When a person understands the truth of the world and lives in harmony with that truth, the soul becomes luminous. It is no longer pulled in opposite directions, no longer tormented by confusion or desire, no longer divided between its higher and lower faculties. Instead, it becomes centered, balanced, and at peace. This inner peace is not passive. It is the peace of a mind in order, a character in balance, and a soul in pursuit of wisdom. It is the peace that emerges when one understands the purpose of life and lives in accordance with it. Maimônides teaches that each step toward intellectual clarity is a step toward the divine, and each step toward moral virtue prepares the soul to receive that clarity. In this way, ethics and spirituality become inseparable. Moral refinement is not an external obligation, but an internal necessity for the soul's ascent. A person whose character is dominated by anger, envy, or desire cannot perceive truth clearly. Just as dust clouds a mirror, so distorted emotions cloud the intellect. When a person practices virtue, moderation, patience, humility, gratitude, the soul becomes transparent. In that transparency, understanding flows freely. This is the spiritual synthesis that defines Maimônides' vision. Truth leads to goodness, goodness leads to clarity, clarity leads to love, and love leads to God. When the soul reaches this state, even ordinary life becomes a form of worship. Eating, sleeping, working, speaking, each act becomes sacred when it is done with intention, balance, and awareness. Maimônides writes that the entire life of a wise person becomes an offering, not through ritual alone, but through the thoughtful ordering of one's existence. The individual no longer lives in fragments, but as a whole being, unified in purpose. In this unity, the soul finds elevation, not in escape, not in emotional ecstasy, not in mystical speculation, but in the profound realization that the path to God lies in the disciplined perfection of the human being. When the intellect perceives truth and the heart reveres it, the soul rises naturally. This elevation is both subtle and powerful. It transforms how one thinks, feels, speaks, and acts. It changes how one sees oneself, others, and the world. It awakens a sense of responsibility, humility, and reverence. It brings a calm strength that does not depend on external circumstances, and it leads to a life of purpose, grounded in wisdom. To focus on oneself, then, is to recognize that the journey toward knowledge is inseparable from the journey toward the divine. The soul ascends not by rejecting reason, but by perfecting it. It rises not by abandoning the world, but by engaging with it through clarity and virtue. And in this ascent, the individual discovers a profound truth. The highest form of spiritual life is the disciplined pursuit of understanding. In that understanding, the soul discovers its true nature. It realizes that its longing for meaning is a longing to perceive the wisdom of creation. It recognizes that its yearning for peace is a yearning to align with truth, and it understands that its search for God is ultimately a search to perfect the light within. This is the synthesis Maimônides offers, a harmony that elevates the entire human being, not through miracles, but through mastery, not through emotion alone, but through understanding, not through escape, but through engagement. When the mind becomes clear, the heart becomes open. When the heart becomes open, the soul becomes elevated. And in that elevation, the human being reaches the fullness of its potential. The teachings of Maimônides are not meant to remain in books, nor to be admired from a distance. They are meant to be lived. The elevation of the soul is not an abstract vision, but a daily discipline, a way of moving through the world with clarity, moderation, purpose, and reverence. To focus on yourself, in the Maimonidean sense, is to cultivate the inner conditions that make wisdom possible. It is to shape your life in a way that aligns your mind, heart, and actions with truth. This section translates Maimônides' timeless philosophy into practical guidance for modern existence. Each principle forms a step in the inner architecture of a life devoted to clarity and spiritual elevation. Begin with the discipline of attention. Maimônides teaches that the scattered mind cannot rise. To focus on yourself is to observe your thoughts, your impulses, your emotional movements, not with judgment, but with awareness. Ask yourself, what am I seeking? What am I avoiding? What patterns shape my decisions? What desires distort my perception? Awareness is the first condition of transformation, for what you cannot see, you cannot refine. From awareness flows moderation. Maimônides insists that the golden mean is the foundation of a stable and elevated soul. This means practicing balance in all areas of life: speech, emotion, desire, consumption, ambition. Speak with thoughtfulness, neither too much nor too little. Allow yourself to feel, but do not allow emotions to govern you. Pursue goals, but not at the cost of inner peace. Eat and drink with discipline. Rest adequately, but avoid idleness. Every balanced action strengthens the soul, while every excess weakens it. Next, cultivate the habit of measured response. Maimônides teaches that a wise person does not react impulsively. When anger arises, slow down. When fear appears, examine it. When desire pushes, pause and reflect. The greatest victories of the soul are won in moments of restraint. Mastery begins not with dramatic acts, but with quiet self-command, choosing the deliberate over the automatic, the thoughtful over the instinctive. This is the essence of self-focus, the ability to govern yourself from within, rather than being ruled by forces from without. Another essential practice is the pursuit of continual learning. Maimônides dedicates his life to the idea that the refinement of the soul depends on the refinement of the intellect. Spend time each day studying something that expands your mind: philosophy, science, ethics, sacred texts, or any disciplined inquiry into truth. This is not mere information gathering. It is training the mind to reason, to question, to understand. Even a few minutes of study done consistently can transform the orientation of the soul. Knowledge becomes a shield against confusion and an engine for growth. Yet knowledge without ethical refinement is incomplete. Therefore, practice virtue intentionally. Choose kindness when harshness feels easier. Practice humility when pride whispers. Exercise patience when haste tempts you. Strengthen gratitude in moments of disappointment. Maimônides teaches that virtue is acquired through repetition. Every ethical act is an engraving on the soul. The more you practice, the more natural it becomes. And as virtue takes root, emotional stability emerges. The soul becomes calm, anchored, and receptive to higher understanding. Equally important is the care of the body. Maimônides, as both physician and philosopher, emphasizes that physical health is inseparable from mental clarity. Sleep adequately. Eat moderately. Strengthen the body through movement. Avoid substances and habits that cloud the mind. A neglected body burdens the intellect and weakens the spirit, while a healthy body supports the pursuit of wisdom. This is not indulgence, it is preparation. The vessel must be sound for the light within to shine without distortion. Next, establish moments of deliberate solitude. Maimônides writes that contemplation requires quiet and detachment from constant stimulation. Set aside time each day to withdraw from noise, screens, conversations, demands, distractions. Sit with your thoughts. Reflect on your actions. Review your intentions. Ask yourself whether you live today with clarity or confusion, with reason or impulse, with purpose or habit. This daily reflection polishes the mirror of the mind. It allows the soul to realign with what truly matters. Then, practice intentional speech. Maimônides warns repeatedly that the tongue is a gateway to both virtue and destruction. Speak truthfully, gently, and with purpose. Avoid gossip, excessive criticism, and empty words. Speak in a way that elevates, not diminishes. The discipline of speech shapes the discipline of thought, and both shape the discipline of the soul. Another principle is the cultivation of gratitude, not as fleeting emotion, but as an intellectual recognition of the goodness woven into existence. Maimônides teaches that gratitude aligns the soul with reality, for it acknowledges order, purpose, and the blessings often overlooked. Begin and end each day by noting one thing for which you are grateful. This simple practice softens the heart, strengthens humility, and shifts the mind from scarcity to abundance. To elevate the soul further, cultivate a sense of purpose in all your actions. Maimônides insists that nothing should be done mindlessly. Eat to sustain the body for virtuous action. Work to contribute meaningfully to society. Engage with others to bring wisdom, kindness, and integrity into the world. When actions are linked to purpose, the ordinary becomes sacred, the mundane becomes meaningful, daily life becomes a path to the divine. Finally, practice intellectual humility. The more one learns, the more one recognizes the depth of what remains unknown. Maimônides views humility as the crown of wisdom. It protects the soul from arrogance, which blinds the intellect and corrupts the heart. Approach life with openness, curiosity, and the recognition that truth is greater than any individual. This humility does not weaken, it strengthens, for it keeps the mind flexible and the soul receptive. When these practices are woven together, attention, moderation, restraint, learning, virtue, health, solitude, intentional speech, gratitude, purpose, and humility, the soul gradually becomes elevated, not through sudden transformation, but through daily refinement. The individual becomes clearer, wiser, quieter, and more attuned to the presence of truth. In this state, one begins to sense the deep connection between personal growth and spiritual life. The search for meaning is no longer abstract. It becomes woven into every action, every thought, every moment of introspection. The individual discovers that focusing on oneself is not narcissistic but necessary, for only a refined soul can bring goodness to the world. Only a disciplined mind can perceive truth. Only a balanced heart can love deeply. Only a unified self can draw near to the divine. This is the legacy of Maimônides, the belief that the human being can rise above distraction, confusion, and impulse, that through reason, virtue, and devotion, one can transform the inner life, that the path to God is open to all who pursue understanding and refine their character, and that the elevation of the soul is the highest purpose of existence. To live this wisdom today is to choose clarity in a world of noise, balance in a world of excess, purpose in a world of haste, and truth in a world of illusion. It is to become, step by step, the person one is capable of being. It is to focus on oneself, not to shrink inward, but to rise upward. And in rising upward, the soul discovers what Maimônides always sought to teach, that human greatness lies not in what we possess, but in what we become.